Hello, my name is Milton.
And my name is Krista.
During this short documentary, we will be beginning our sentences in one location
and ending them in others as we talk about different types of transportation and the carbon cycle.
Now, you may be wondering, what is the carbon cycle? And to a lesser extent, why should we care?
Well, the carbon cycle is the recycling of carbon as it moves from the reservoir, which can be a body of water or plant, to the atmosphere and back to the reservoirs again. Before the Industrial Revolution, the carbon cycle was pretty much in balance, as carbon moved from the atmosphere to the plants, eventually releasing the carbon back into the atmosphere.
Some of this carbon would go into reservoirs like the ocean or fossil fuels, but because humans exist, we emit carbon into the atmosphere through human activities like transportation, deforestation, and burning fossil fuels. So thus, the carbon cycle is out of balance.
Carbon flows by first being absorbed from the atmosphere as carbon dioxide by plants through photosynthesis, then is passed through the food chains as animals eat the plants, and is finally released back into the atmosphere through respiration by both plants and animals as they break down into organic matter.
Our emissions cause the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and plants are no longer able to filter enough out.
According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA for short, some mitigating practices that can be used to reduce carbon emissions are by making more zero-emission vehicles and by using or making more public transportation systems.
According to the World Research Institute, around 70% of carbon emissions are from motorization. Moving on to public transport. Although it produces carbon emissions, public transportation can hold a lot more passengers than a single occupancy vehicle, such as a car.
According to CPB, buses and trains can release up to a fifth of emissions per passenger kilometer than ride-hailing and about a third of that of a private vehicle.
However, some limitations of public transport are that it's mostly located in big cities and can sometimes be overcrowded.
Carbon dioxide consists of one carbon atom bonded to two oxygen atoms. Carbon circulates through the environment in a cycle, where organisms absorb carbon from the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, then release it back through respiration or decomposition.
They take in carbon as carbon dioxide due to their balance of oxygen in the air, which allows the two elements to bond into carbon dioxide. In a carbon cycle, ideally there is a balance of carbon and other colorless gases in the air.
Photosynthesis utilizes carbon dioxide so that plants can generate energy from its release into the atmosphere, which occurs through cellular respiration.
The interactions of these processes sustain life on Earth due to carbon's readiness to bond with other substances and play a vital role in the carbon cycle.
Some carbon is stored in carbon reservoirs, such as the largest carbon reservoir found in the world's oceans.
Carbon shifts between these reservoirs through various processes like photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, and weathering, thereby forming the global carbon cycle.
Vehicles emit carbon, contributing carbon dioxide to the environment. However, these emissions pose a problem because there are now too many carbon emissions, particularly from low passenger vehicles like cars.
If the air contains an imbalance of carbon, the carbon cycle will be disrupted, impacting the regulation of Earth's climate through carbon reservoirs that absorb and store carbon. Then the climate will also become imbalanced, leading to global warming.
So, how can the carbon cycle be restored?
Well, two things you can do are take public transportation so it reduces carbon emissions, and compost also helps to restore the carbon cycle.
Biological carbon sequestration is the process by which plants, including trees, absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in their biomass, like leaves, branches, trunks, and roots. It's a natural way that carbon gets pulled out of the air.
Exactly. Now, how does this process happen? It all starts with photosynthesis. Trees take in carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to make glucose and oxygen. The glucose is then stored as biomass, which is the carbon being sequestered, and the oxygen is released back into the air.
That's right. So, trees, with their large size, are really important for this process. They store a lot of carbon in their trunks and roots, helping to keep the atmosphere clear. The more trees there are, the more carbon dioxide they can take in.
But there's another process we need to mention, cellular respiration. This happens when trees and other organisms break down glucose to release energy for growth and other functions. When they do this, they release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. This means the carbon cycle keeps moving. Carbon gets absorbed by plants during photosynthesis and gets released again during cellular respiration.
Trees are like nature's carbon storage units. The carbon they absorb can get locked up in their biomass for a very long time, as long as the trees stay alive and healthy. But humans are messing with this process.
That's right. Human activities like burning fossil fuels for energy and cutting down forests are adding extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. One of the biggest sources of CO2 is transportation emissions. When we drive vehicles that burn gasoline, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This adds more carbon to the atmosphere, which trees can't absorb fast enough, thus making the problem worse.
Deforestation is another big issue. When trees are cut down, the carbon stored in their trunks, branches, and roots is released back into the atmosphere, contributing to even more carbon dioxide in the air. So, when we lose trees, losing an important natural tool to fight climate change. So, the excess carbon from things like car emissions just keeps piling up.
That's why protecting our forests and reducing vehicle emissions by using cleaner energy and more sustainable transportation is so important. We need trees to absorb the carbon we're putting into the air, but we also need to stop adding so much carbon in the first place.
The more trees we have, the more carbon they can sequester, and the healthier our planet will be.
The carbon cycle, as it currently stands, is out of balance due to human activities. As we discussed earlier, this leads to carbon being released into the atmosphere faster than natural processes like photosynthesis can take it in, leading to the disruption of the natural equilibrium of the carbon cycle, making an imbalance with too much carbon and not enough oxygen.
According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, this extra carbon dioxide is lowering the ocean's pH through a process called ocean acidification.
This impacts the carbon cycle and human health and many other things.
According to the United Nations, climate change is the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns.
The UN lists that some of the causes of climate change include generating electricity, heat, and emissions due to burning fossil fuels and transportation emissions.
Some other causes are deforestation and non-nuclear power plants.
The increase of greenhouse gases such as CO2 in the atmosphere due to the carbon cycle being impacted by human activities will trap the sun's radiation on Earth instead of escaping back up to space, causing a higher global temperature.
The NOAA finds that greenhouse gases trapped 79% more heat in 2021 than in 1990, and greenhouse gases, plus 2 banned ozone-depleting chemicals, account for about 96% of the excess heat trapped in the atmosphere due to human activity since 1750.
A significant source of these emissions comes from the transportation sector, which is responsible for a large portion of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide or CO2. As we look for ways to reduce our environmental impact, one of the most effective approaches is to reconsider how we travel.
Transitioning to cleaner transportation options, such as electric vehicles and public transport, can help significantly cut down on emissions, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and helping to mitigate the effects of climate change.
We will begin our showcase of vehicles with the humble car. You might be asking, what is the impact of passenger vehicles? Well, the average car emits about 400 grams of CO2 per mile. So what are the promises that companies are making? Companies promise electric cars that promise to lower tailpipe emissions of cars, which they do because they don't have a tailpipe. This all seems great, right? Well, unfortunately, cars have the highest carbon emissions per passenger, with a single car producing about 6 to 9 tons per year, which seems less than other transportation methods like trains, but the average car only has room for about 4 people, though there are usually only about 1.5 people per vehicle. And finally, not only does your car produce CO2, but they also leak hydrofluoric carbons from its air conditioners.
Now, what are the pros for cars? The great thing about cars is that they are the most versatile form of transportation, with the only thing they need is roads, unlike trains where they need tracks to run. Cars are also moving towards electric, which is a cleaner form of transportation when compared to cars that run on gas.
On the other hand, Cars are one of the biggest producers of CO2, needing to consume gasoline, which is a refined product of petroleum, meaning that to get the fuel in the car, it first needs to go through a plant that refines it.
We interviewed Avery for her opinions on the matter.
What impact do you think that cars have on the environment in terms of carbon emission?
I don't know a lot about cars, but I know that they release a lot of smoke, or I'm guessing it's carbon emissions, that ends up going into the atmosphere, which is not very good.
Do you think taking a bus or your car is more efficient in terms of which one is better for the environment from St. Louis to Chicago?
Is it a bus?
And finally, we move on to trains. Now, what impact do passenger trains have on the environment? An Amtrak GE Genesis diesel locomotive produces 33.6 kilograms of carbon dioxide per mile, which is about the same as 84 cars. But Amtrak trains can carry up to 512 people, which is equal to 128 cars, assuming 4 people per vehicle. Now, this is great, but Amtrak is working to upgrade their trains to be even more efficient, with the Missouri River Runner line already having been upgraded and meeting Tier 4 EPA emissions standards, meaning that PM and NOx emissions will be further reduced by about 90%.
But what are the limitations? Trains are mainly used for intra-city transportation, not transportation within cities. Trains with low passenger numbers will have a higher per passenger carbon footprint than a full train.
And in Europe, countries have different voltages on their railways that are tailored to their own power grid, making it difficult for trains to service countries with voltages different from their own.
Don't just take it from us. We asked Tony, the station master at Kirkwood Amtrak Station, for his responses to these questions.
What impact do you think trains have on the environment in terms of carbon emissions?
Per person, probably they reduce it. I can't give you an amount because you
Yeah.
have to make measurements on that and then equate it to how many people ride the train. But I would give you a guesstimate maybe that probably it would cut the carbon emissions by about half.
Do you think that taking a train or your car from St. Louis to Chicago is more efficient or better for the environment?
Taking the train would be more efficient.
Yeah.
Plus, it's safer.
Those are some great takes, but let's get into the pros and cons of rail transportation. Some pros of rail transportation include the fact that trains are one of the safest and most efficient ways to travel in all parts of the world. And with most railways being upgraded to electric emissions, they will be reduced by up to 70% compared to diesel locomotives. The switch to electric locomotives allows for shorter electrification and break-in times, meaning that you can get to your destination faster.
But unfortunately, differing voltages prevent quick travel between countries, especially in Europe. The biggest problem with electric rail is that upgrading from diesel to electric takes about $7.3 billion solely for the trains, not including the rail infrastructure that needs to be upgraded. Also, destinations can be limited due to limited rail infrastructure.
As global warming continues and the carbon cycle continues to be imbalanced, photosynthesis and cellular respiration continue to work at the same level they always have. But because of the human activity of transportation we discussed, they will continue not to work at a high enough speed in order to sequester the excess carbon in the atmosphere.
And now that you know all about transportation methods and their impact on carbon emissions, we hope that you'll consider the carbon cycle the next time you choose to use your car.
Thank you for watching.